Hello, my name is Maren Price. I've been working at Utah Valley in care management since August as a student social work intern, and I'll graduate at the end of April with my master's in social work. So, this presentation about self care comes from a place of personal passion that we create a self and community culture of caring for our caregivers. So, health caregivers, and I'm talking, this could be nurses, doctors, social workers, CNAs, administrators, anyone who's involved in healthcare often feel called to the work of carrying the burdens of others, patients in acute need, long-term care, etc. And this has become especially relevant during COVID when caregivers were and are carrying the world through the stress of the unknown. So, in this time of carrying the world, caregivers absorb a lot of secondary trauma. And the backlash of that is that we've seen and lived through the stories of healthcare workers leaving the profession, getting burnt out, compassion fatigue due to, things like unsafe staffing shortages, PPE shortages, travel pay versus permanent pay, et cetera, et cetera. And there's articles upon articles. And I've listed a few articles that highlight this issue that will be at the end of the presentation. So my purpose for this presentation is to highlight why we need to address community and self-care. And one of the ways, or one strategy, one activity that we can do, that we can work within the systems we operate in to cultivate this culture of self and community care. Some of the concepts and ideas for this presentation come from the book Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky. Okay. We often assume that our very status as helpers grants us immunity from the suffering we witness. We are often wrong. I find this quote to be piercing. And in my experience talking with other helpers, and that could be any type of counselor, nurses, CNAs, anyone who works in helping professions, but specifically healthcare, I've found it to be a common attitude that we cannot be touched by the work that we're doing, that we have this special resiliency. And I think on some level that is true. However, we're not completely immune to what the secondary trauma can do to us. And this is why not only discussing, but practicing self and community care is crucial. And again, as we're seeing people leaving the profession, we need to create better cultures. So I like to define community care as individuals and systems working together to support the mutual health and care of both the system and the individual. The individual gets what they need to accomplish the work. The system successfully accomplishes its goals. Kathy Supiano is a clinical social worker and an associate professor in the College of Nursing at the University of Utah. She's also the director of Caring Connections, a hope and comfort in grief program at the University College of Nursing. In an episode on the podcast Hospice and Palliative Nurses Association's Podcast Corner, Kathy describes compassion fatigue for nurses in particular, but I would add any healthcare worker can experience this. Compassion fatigue is the place where the demands of the situation outstrip the ability of the individual to meet those demands. And this moment of resistance where that, demand outstrips that ability says nothing about the ability of the individual. In our current healthcare system, we focus on increasing the resiliency of that healthcare worker, which is crucial. However, even our most resilient healthcare workers have a point where those demands are just going to outstrip that resilient ability. Dr. Supiano suggests that while we must do everything to help our nurses, and I would add, again, all healthcare workers to become more resilient, we need to reform the healthcare system so that the demands that we are placing on these individuals are, quote, fair, reasonable, and equitable. And that requires both sides to do their part to make this possible. Healthcare workers work to increase their resiliency, administrators to support and fight for changes that support healthcare workers, and both to speak up for each other to make positive changes. I'm going to link that podcast episode again at the end of this presentation with those articles. So I don't want this to become another trite conversation about or discussion about self-care techniques, what's available, what fits for you, what we should suggest, find a plan. Although I do encourage each of us to identify and find strategies that do fit for us, hobbies and activities that we're energized by, establishing a daily routine or tasks that help us maintain sanity, help us find purpose, maintain our purpose. But when we are discussing self-care, we often place the responsibility on the individual to find and make time to carry out their self-care tasks. And I don't know about you, but when we're coming home from an 8, 10, or 12-hour shift, the last thing we want to do is a task that requires lots of thought and energy. Self-care often gets put aside, and this is completely understandable. So if you feel like you cannot get a grip on your own self-care and do the things that you need to get ahead, if you feel like you don't have the energy to do that, you're not alone. And this is not meant to call you out. This is meant to encourage you to make that time and also encourage all of us to help each other make that time. So one thing we can do to help make that time is a quick exercise. Let's show you. This is called, excuse me, a SWOT analysis. And a SWOT analysis can kind of help us step out of the situation and see the bigger picture and work together to find to create plans of action. As you can see, it's pretty self-explanatory. There's 4 categories: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And what we're going to do is sit down and just list out the different strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities of self-care, community care. You want to do this exercise for yourself, your department, your team, your office mates, not your office mates self-care, but you as a team. I'm specifically thinking care management. Any sort of pod that you work in, this can be really helpful. I also want to mention that when we're making this list, we don't want to stop at 3 to 5 ideas per category. We really want to get those juices flowing. The more options we have, the better, the easier it is for us to find excuse me, to find a plan that we can work with and follow to make those changes. Okay, so once we've created that plan, well, okay, here's a brief example, excuse me. Here's a brief example of a SWOT analysis that I completed for my own self-care practices. You'll notice that the strengths section is much larger, and that's not because I think I have a lot of strengths over these other categories. It's more that I did this at a time during the day when I didn't have the mental capacity to do more than that. But I think it can show you a good example of what can happen when you stop at just getting a few ideas. You can see with the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, I just have less material to pull from that shows me where I can make changes and actually control what's going on. An additional note is for a department or a team SWOT, it's important to get everyone involved because you're going to get a broader perspective. And all the people on the team are the ones who are invested in creating that culture of community care and help that we can work together to really make those changes. And I highly recommend this exercise because it helps us listen to each other and realize how well we're doing, where the holes are, and what kind of plan we need to make. After completing your SWOT analysis and creating a plan of action, I recommend that we consider these questions. Excuse me. From the SWOT analysis, what is your priority to tackle as the individual, as an administrator, whatever your role is on the team? And then additionally, what would the other side say? And this is a reminder that the goal is for all of us to be at the same table, on the same side of the table. So not necessarily what's the other half, what's the other side saying, but what is my team? What can we all agree on? And is my priority the same as theirs? How can we come to some sort of consensus about what we can change and what we can work on? Okay. And then this last one, I think this is really crucial to keep doing the work that we're doing. Why am I doing what am I doing? Why am I doing what I am doing? Why did I get into healthcare? Can I currently connect to whatever motivates or motivated me to start to be in healthcare to keep going? This can also help us know what should be our top priority as we're looking at plans of action. So this quote, no one can do it for us and no one will do it for us, comes from Terry Ann Flint, the director of employee wellness at Intermountain. I love this idea. Um, and I think that one of the biggest reasons we don't take time for self-care is because of the pressures associated with a busy hospital floor, whatever type of team or practice you work in, specifically in the floor. There's not always time to sit down and talk about these things and do the self-care. But with that said, if we want to see changes happening, we do not need to wait for administration to institute system-wide policies for making self and community care possible. Now, to be clear, I'm not condoning that we go outside of company policy. I'm saying that there's always something we can tweak within an existing system to make a more acceptable culture. And I imagine that systems of community and self-care, that successful systems of community and self-care are happening all around us. And I hope that we can find those and identify those systems and understand how to duplicate their amazing work. So my challenge to you today is to choose one thing that you can do for yourself and one thing that you can do for someone else on your team. Maybe you can't sit down and do the SWOT analysis today, but there is one way that I'm sure you can identify one way today that you could help someone do their own self-care practice. And then lastly, here are my references. There's a few here are the reference to the book, the articles about the losing healthcare workers, and then that excellent podcast episode about moral distress and complicated grief, how we can support our healthcare workers. I just hope that we can find ways to work within the systems we have to create cultures that help us retain our healthcare workers and retain our health and support each other. Thank you for listening.